In the dust-hung twilight of the American frontier, where wooden porches creaked under the boots of wanderers and the wind carried the dry whisper of long-forgotten trails, there stood the saloons, half refuge, half chaos, wholly alive. Their swinging doors flapped with the rhythm of the Old West, and inside them all manner of faces gathered. Cowboys with sunburnt cheeks, silver-tongued gamblers, prospectors with pockets full of hope but not much more, and travelers who had followed the horizon so long they no longer remembered what had pushed them toward it. And those saloons were famed for whiskey that burned hot enough to sear regret from the tongue, and beer that foamed with the promise of temporary relief, they were also known for something far humbler: food. Not gourmet food. Not delicate food. Not food meant to charm the palate. No, saloon food in the Wild West was something else entirely. Practical, sometimes peculiar, occasionally delightful, and nearly always a reflection of what the frontier demanded: durability, thrift, and the ability to satisfy a hunger shaped by hard travel and harder work. This story is not merely about meals. It is about the people who cooked them, the people who ate them, and the peculiar world in which such dishes became legends of their own. Imagine a dusty trail rider entering a saloon after days of driving cattle beneath a sun that turned the prairie into a shimmering sea of heat. His stomach growls. His throat feels like someone lined it with sand. The first thing he asks for might be whiskey, but the second is always food: anything warm, anything hearty, anything that lets him feel human again. And so, from Dodge City to Deadwood, from Tombstone to Abilene, saloon cooks began forming a kind of rough tradition, one that would define what meals came to mean in the Wild West. Now close your eyes, if you like, and picture one of those saloons. Perhaps it has red kerosene lanterns that cast a sultry glow against the poker tables. Perhaps a piano in the corner tries to play a valiant tune despite missing a few keys. The air smells of tobacco smoke, spilled beer, dust, and something sizzling from a back kitchen that looks barely big enough to house a stove. But that small kitchen, that cramped heart of the saloon, is where the story truly begins. In most saloons, the first thing served, the thing nearly everyone could rely on, was chili. Not the chili we know today, but a rugged ancestor. Tough beef trimmings simmered so long they surrendered their stubbornness, soaked beans swelling like tiny promises, and spices that wandered from one cook to the next, depending on what they had been able to gather or trade for. Frontier chili was notorious. Some saloons were praised for chili that warmed the bones. Others had chili so explosive, so fiery, so unpredictably seasoned that travelers told stories of it for miles. Cooks, limited by ingredients, used whatever meat they had: beef, buffalo, venison, and occasionally something less identifiable. Chili became the equalizer of the West: cheap, filling, easy to keep warm through an endless night. Alongside it were stews of every kind. A saloon stew was a living, breathing creature, never the same twice. One day it might be beef and carrots. The next, rabbit and potatoes. The next, a collection of leftovers that had nowhere else to go. It was cooked in iron pots blackened by years of fire, stirred by tired hands, and ladled into bowls that sometimes chipped at the edges. Yet to those who ate it, it was comfort. After all, stew required only time, a little salt, and whatever the frontier offered. The men and women who ate it rarely complained. They were grateful simply to have something warm after a long day. Then there was sourdough bread, a staple beloved from saloons to mining camps. The frontier had no shortage of sourdough starters, bubbly mixtures kept alive by cooks like prized livestock. Some starters were said to be older than the towns themselves, passed down by gold miners or inherited from long-gone bakers. A good sourdough loaf could lift even the dreariest saloon meal. Its crust crackled under rough hands, its tangy aroma mixed with the saloon's smoky air, and its warm interior soaked up stew or chili until each bite became a little piece of comfort. Bread and saloons became inseparable companions. But saloons served more than the humble or the hardy. Some were surprisingly creative, especially those located near cattle trails, railroads, and large towns. Take the notorious cowboy steak, a thick slab of beef cooked on cast-iron pans that hissed with pride when they met the meat. A cowboy who had driven cattle hundreds of miles could barely contain his joy when a saloon cook placed such a steak before him. The steaks varied wildly in quality. A good one was juicy, flavorful, and tender enough to cut with a slightly determined fork. A bad one? Well, let's just say there were times when knives snapped in half trying to conquer them. Yet no one refused a steak in the West. And where there was steak, there was beans. Not the sweet molasses beans of later years, but simple, salted beans cooked low and slow. Beans were the great equalizer. They fed the poor and wealthy alike. Saloons kept large pots of them warm for hours, and a cowboy could fill his belly for a few coins. When served with cornbread, sourdough, or even hardtack softened in gravy, beans became a meal worthy of gratitude. But perhaps the strangest and most memorable thing saloons served was tough frontier coffee. Not food, but practically treated like it. Coffee grounds were reused so many times in some places that travelers joked the brew could walk out of the pot by itself. Some saloons boiled coffee until it turned blacker than a starless night and served it in tin cups that burned the hands of the unwary. Yet coffee was cherished. It kept cowboys awake during long rides, gamblers alert during long nights, and travelers comforted during moments of loneliness. It was bitter, yes, but dependable like the frontier itself. Now picture another type of saloon. One in a mining town where the men spent their days hacking at the earth, breathing dust, and dreaming of fortune. These saloons often leaned heavily on meat pies, pork chops, corned beef, and pickled vegetables. Pickling was essential. Fresh produce spoiled fast in the West, so cucumbers, onions, beets, and even eggs were submerged in brine until they became salty time capsules of flavor. Miners would buy pickled eggs from glass jars sitting on the counter, and though the sight was not always appetizing, the taste offered much-needed variety. Of course, we cannot overlook salt pork, that iconic, chewy, sometimes overly salty slab of fat and meat that formed the backbone of many saloon meals. Salt pork appeared in beans, stews, and fried dishes. In many saloons, it was the closest thing to bacon available, though far less glamorous. Its flavor was strong and its presence unmistakable. In towns near ranches or farms, saloons had access to more variety. Here came fried chicken, beloved and quickly devoured. Chickens were easier to raise than cattle, and the crunchy golden meal, when available, felt like a luxury. Alongside chicken came biscuits and gravy, sometimes served at breakfast, sometimes at midnight. Thick white gravy made from drippings and flour-covered biscuits, so dense they seemed to defy the laws of softness. Yet after a day in the saddle or a week on the rails, even dense biscuits tasted like heaven. And then there were oysters, yes, oysters, in the middle of the Wild West. Thanks to railroads and preserved shipping methods, some saloons in larger towns served canned oysters in stews, soups, or even fried. To newcomers, seeing oysters offered in a dusty desert town felt surreal, almost magical. But they became a symbol of prosperity. If a saloon served oysters, business was booming. Another saloon staple was jerky. Beef jerky, buffalo jerky, venison jerky, whatever meat could be dried, smoked, and preserved. It hung behind counters like a display of survival tactics. Travelers bought strips to chew on during long rides. But saloons often added jerky to soups or served it alongside whiskey as a kind of frontier snack. Now imagine the saloon at night. Outside, the desert or prairie sits quiet under the moon. Inside, lamplight pools on the tables. Cards shuffle, whiskey glows amber. A tired cook wipes sweat from their brow as they pull another pot off the fire. Maybe they serve fried potatoes, crisp and unevenly sliced. Maybe they have griddle cakes, browned and slightly sweet. Maybe the week's supplies have just come in and they're offering fresh eggs, ham, or even apple pie, slightly burnt on the edges but cherished nonetheless. The food tells the story of the saloon. And the saloon tells the story of the West. There were saloons run by immigrants who brought food traditions from faraway lands. Irish saloon owners served shepherd's pie or boiled potatoes. German owners offered sausages, schnitzel, or pickled cabbage. Mexican cantinas served tamales, enchiladas, or spiced meats that left travelers speechless with delight. Chinese cooks, who were among the culinary masters of the West, offered stir-fried vegetables, noodles, and pork dishes when the saloon owners were open-minded enough to hire them. To taste their food was to taste comfort, precision, and quiet brilliance. Not every saloon had such variety. Many offered nothing more exotic than the basics: stew, beans, bread, and coffee. But whether simple or elaborate, saloon food reflected both what the land allowed and what the people needed. It kept cowboys fed, miners sustained, gamblers awake, and travelers satisfied enough to continue their journeys. Now picture a solitary cowboy sitting at a saloon table, spooning chili from a tin bowl. He watches the lamp flames flicker. He listens to the murmur of voices, the rustle of playing cards, the thud of boots against the wooden floor. The chili is spicy, perhaps too spicy, but he eats anyway. He's tired, he's hungry. He feels the warmth spreading through him, grounding him after days of wind, dust, and solitude. When he finishes, he wipes his mouth with the back of his hand and leans back, letting the warmth of both the meal and the saloon sink into him. A simple moment, one repeated thousands of times across the West, but meaningful. A prospector, hands still trembling from a near miss at a mine shaft, sits with a plate of salted pork and beans. His beard is coated with dust. He eats slowly, savoring each bite. He came close to death today, closer than he wants to think about, and this humble meal feels like a reaffirmation of life. A dance hall girl sits behind the bar during a rare break, nibbling on sourdough dipped into stew. Her feet ache. Her voice is hoarse. But the meal gives her strength enough to return to the stage and the bright smiles her job requires. A gambler, sharp-eyed and smooth-voiced, forks pieces of steak between hands of cards. He chews thoughtfully before announcing a raise. His appetite and ambition run equally deep. A cook wipes flour-streaked hands on his apron, proud of the biscuits he has baked today. The oven was stubborn, the ingredients limited, and yet the result made patrons nod with approval. Now shift your gaze to a different saloon, one out on the fringes of civilization. Supplies rarely arrive on time. The cook improvises constantly. Today's meal might be rabbit stew with meat caught by the saloon owner at dawn. Tomorrow might be buffalo steak if a hunter stops by with meat to sell. Perhaps prairie chicken, roasted and seasoned with whatever herbs can be grown in a small window garden. Food in these saloons is unpredictable, but the unpredictability gives it charm. Some saloons became legendary for their food, their reputation spreading across the trails. Cowboys would ride extra miles knowing a certain place served biscuits better than a mother's kitchen, or steaks so good they softened even the harshest spirits. Prospectors would save their coin for a rare night of indulgence, a pie, a hearty stew, a plate of fried potatoes. Other saloons were infamous for their terrible cuisine. There were stories half true, half exaggeration of stews that had been reheated for so many days they had achieved a life of their own. Jokes circulated of cooks who kept one pot going for months, merely adding new ingredients as needed. Yet patrons still ate, because the West taught people to expect little and appreciate much. Food in Wild West saloons, you see, was never just sustenance. It was the flavor of the frontier, rough, simple, improvised, and honest. It told the story of survival, of creativity born from scarcity, of cooks who, despite limited resources, poured effort into feeding strangers who often had nowhere else to go. Imagine a saloon closing for the night. The poker tables are empty, the lanterns dim. The piano player has packed up his instrument. In the kitchen, pots sit cooling on the stove. A half-empty jar of pickled eggs waits on the counter. Bread dough rests for tomorrow's baking. A pot of beans thickens as it cools. The cook finally removes their apron and steps outside into the quiet night, staring at the stars that glitter above the endless prairie. They know that tomorrow will bring hungry cowboys, thirsty gamblers, and weary travelers. They know supplies may run low and they'll need to improvise. They know the dishes they prepare will offer comfort in small, essential ways. And in the morning, as the sun rises and the frontier comes alive again, the saloon will open its doors, and the scent of brewing coffee and frying bacon will drift out into the dusty street. The West lives through its food unexpected, humble, rugged, delicious in its own rough way. And in every saloon that once stood beneath the endless sky, the meals they served became part of the grand, gritty legend of the frontier. The morning after a long night in a Wild West saloon always carried a different rhythm, slower, sleepier, softened by the glow that filtered through dusty windows. Before the cowboys, miners, gamblers, and wanderers returned to their routines, it was the kitchen that woke first. Long before the first boots touched the wooden floorboards and long before the first coin clinked at the bar, the saloon cook was already moving, coaxing life back into the embers of the stove. A thin blue thread of smoke rose from the chimney as cast-iron pans clanged softly. The cook added wood to the fire, stirring coals until they glowed with a fierce, hungry orange. The heat licked the metal of the pans, warming them for the first task of the day: breakfast. Saloon breakfasts were not elegant affairs, but they were exactly what frontier life demanded: filling, straightforward, and ready to fuel long hours of riding, mining, hauling, gambling, or drifting. The simplest breakfast was coffee. Thick, almost muddy frontier coffee, boiled until strong enough to jolt even the sleepiest traveler awake. The aroma crept through the saloon like a quiet announcement that the day had begun. Then came griddle cakes, known today as pancakes. Though the frontier versions were rougher, made with flour that sometimes clumped and milk that wasn't always fresh. Still, when cooked with butter sizzling on the pan, they offered comfort in every bite. Beside them fried salt pork, which popped angrily in the skillet as the fat rendered. The cook sliced it thin to make it crisp, though some preferred chunkier cuts that required stronger teeth. Eggs, when available, were fried beside the pork, their edges curling and browning. Some weeks, eggs were plentiful. Other weeks, non-existent, depending on farmers and supply wagons. Then there were biscuits, heavy, floury, satisfying biscuits. They often appeared at all hours of the day because they made everything better. Beans, gravy, stew, hunger, heartbreak, and especially loneliness. A cowboy could sit at a table with a plate of biscuits and feel, for a moment, that the world was not quite as empty or unforgiving as the open prairie. As the saloon slowly filled with the smells of breakfast, travelers wandered in. Boots thumped against the floor. A tired gambler rubbed his eyes, the memory of last night's cards still lingering. A cowboy leaned against the bar, squinting at the morning light. A dancehall girl with tangled hair wiped crumbs from the counter as she reached for a cup of coffee. And from the tables, murmurs of the new day began quiet stories of yesterday's rides, hopes for new cattle drives, rumors of gold strikes, and the kind of gossip that thrived where strangers gathered. Food was the heartbeat of these early hours. But outside of breakfast, saloons also prepared meals for travelers who wanted something hearty or something that reminded them of home, or at least helped them forget how far home really was. That was where roasts came in. Beef roasts, pork roasts, even mutton roasts. They cooked slowly, sometimes for nearly a full day, filling the saloon with a warm, savory aroma that drew in patrons like moths to fire. A good roast could lift spirits, soothe tempers, and turn a rough night into a manageable memory. Some saloons had specialties. In Tombstone, a place was known for its roast buffalo, seasoned with wild herbs and slow-cooked until tender. In Dodge City, there was a saloon famous for smoked beef, dark as midnight and full of deep, earthy flavor. In Deadwood, a place run by a French immigrant made savory onion gravy that patrons claimed was better than gold. No one knew the recipe, though many tried to guess. He guarded it like treasure, stirring his pot in quiet pride. Across the frontier, a few saloons introduced something unusual for the time: fresh vegetables. Not many and not often, but enough to make patrons pause in disbelief. A plate of boiled cabbage. A handful of carrots stewed in butter, a sliced turnip. These vegetables cost more than most meat simply because supplying them was so difficult. But when they were served, they felt like delicacies, like a taste of civilization amid the wildness. In mining towns, vegetables took on almost mythic status. A prospector might trade a day's worth of gold dust for a plate of boiled potatoes if he'd been living on salt pork and beans for too long. And the saloons knew this. They made vegetables last as long as possible, storing them in root cellars, pickling them, or drying them for soups. Speaking of soups, saloon soup was a thing unto itself, a common dish with uncommon stories. It was often a catch-all meal: leftover meat, bones simmered for hours, scraps of vegetables, bits of bread, and whatever spices the cook had on hand. Some soups were thin and simple, meant to stretch ingredients. Others were thick, hearty, and comforting. A bowl of soup could warm a traveler's bones after a cold night on the trail. It softened the edge of hunger that had gnawed at him since dawn. It reminded him that even in an untamed land, a hot meal held power. Some saloons, especially those owned by immigrants, introduced dishes that broadened the frontier's culinary world. German saloons served sausages, sauerkraut, and mustard with flavors so bold they startled cowboys accustomed to simpler fare. Irish cooks introduced stews thickened with barley, and sometimes even shepherd's pie if potatoes could be sourced. Mexican cantinas offered dishes rich with chili, tomatoes, and spice tamales, carne asada, and slow-cooked beans that left travelers dreaming of them long after they'd moved on. In Texas, saloons near the Rio Grande often served barbacoa, meat cooked slowly underground until tender enough to pull apart with the fingers. Cowboys who tasted it often swore they'd never had anything better. They said it tasted like fire and smoke and celebration all at once. Chinese cooks skilled in ways that astonished frontier towns introduced stir-fries, noodles, and dumplings. When saloons hired Chinese chefs, the food quality often changed dramatically. Dishes became balanced, flavorful, and expertly cooked. Some travelers who had spent years eating nothing but beef and beans tasted Chinese cuisine for the first time and felt as though they had stepped into another world. Frontier newspapers occasionally wrote with awe about celestial cooking and the magical hands of Chinese chefs. But despite these variations, the core of saloon food remained rooted in practicality. Food was there to fill a belly, soothe exhaustion, warm the spirit, and give a man or woman the strength to continue facing the harsh realities of the West. One of the most interesting features of saloon meals was timing. Unlike modern restaurants, saloons rarely had set meal times. A cowboy might walk in at dawn and ask for stew. A gambler might call for a steak at midnight. The cook worked on a continuous cycle: pots simmering, pans sizzling, dough rising, coffee brewing so that something warm could always be offered. Then there were evening feasts, an occasional delight. When cattle drives were successful, when gold was found, or when a celebration was needed, saloons would put on spreads of food that astonished even the most jaded traveler. Large platters of steak, piles of biscuits, towering plates of fried chicken, rivers of gravy, mountains of potatoes, pies stacked cooling on windowsills. The air would shimmer with warmth and spice as people from all walks of life ate together in rare harmony. These nights were precious. They brought laughter, stories, new friendships, and sometimes the beginnings of legends. But not all saloon food was beloved. Some dishes gained infamy. There were jokes about stew pots that had never been fully emptied, their contents simply renewed day after day. A few saloons became the subject of dark legends about what exactly went into their chili stories, whispered by travelers who swore they tasted something too strange to be beef. Whether these tales were true or simply products of imagination, no one knew. But the legends spread and they became part of the Wild West's culinary mythos. Saloon food also carried with it the essence of survival. When harsh winter struck, when supply wagons were late, or when predators attacked livestock, the menus shifted dramatically. Meals became simpler, scarcer. Bread replaced meat. Potatoes replaced vegetables. Beans became the backbone of the menu. And yet, even in the toughest times, saloons remained open. Their kitchens became symbols of resilience. Their meals, no matter how modest, became symbols of hope. There were stories of cooks who went out at dawn with rifles to hunt rabbits or prairie chickens to keep their menus alive. Stories of women who baked pies from wild berries they found near riverbanks. Stories of saloon owners who shared food with townsfolk during blizzards or droughts, knowing that survival was a collective effort. Food brought people together in ways guns never could. A weary cowboy might share a loaf of bread with a stranger. A gambler might offer half his steak to a new friend. A prospector might trade a nugget of gold for a pie, then eat it on the porch with anyone who wandered by. The food at Wild West saloons wasn't just nourishment, it was a language, a symbol, a ritual, a bond. Even the toughest men softened when presented with a warm meal. Even the loneliest travelers felt less alone when seated at a saloon table with a plate of stew. And even the most hardened drifters knew that when life in the West became unbearable, there was always one place they could walk into and find comfort. A saloon flickering with lamplight and offering whatever food the frontier allowed. And so the story continues, stretching beyond one saloon, beyond one town, into the vast expanse of the West, where countless kitchens cooked countless meals that fed countless spirits. Night returned to the frontier with its usual quiet authority, spreading itself across the plains like a blanket stitched from darkness and starlight. The saloon just hours ago, a sleepy breakfast den, was once again the thumping heart of the town. A fiddle whined from the corner stage, boots tapped against the wooden floorboards, and the glow of kerosene lanterns shimmered against poker chips and glass bottles. But while the patrons laughed, drank, argued, or played cards, the most important corner of the saloon remained the kitchen, where food simmered like a story waiting to be told. Out back, the cook adjusted his apron and lifted a lid from a massive iron pot. Steam rolled out, rich with the smell of simmering beef and onions, an aroma so comforting it could almost silence a bar fight. Tonight's stew was thicker than last night's, thanks to fresh potatoes from a farmer who had just rolled into town with a wagon full of vegetables and a smile that suggested he denegotiated a fair price. The cook stirred the pot with a long wooden spoon worn smooth from years of service. He tasted the broth, nodded in satisfaction, and added a pinch of salt that glittered like tiny crystals in the flickering firelight. Tonight would be busy. The door swung open and a wave of dusty travelers stumbled in, hungry from days spent on the trail. Their faces were burned by sun, their clothes creased and torn by wind. They crowded toward the bar, asking first for drink and then for food. The cook had prepared for this. He'd baked 3 large trays of sourdough bread, the crusts golden brown and crisp. When he tapped them with his knuckles, they responded with a hollow thwack, a sound that brought a strange comfort to those familiar with frontier cooking. Bread was always loved. Bread made the world feel less cruel. The bartender cut thick slices and laid them on tin plates, each slice steaming in the cool night air. Patrons tore bread apart with their hands, dipping pieces into stew, soaking up gravy, savoring each bite as though it were a lifeline. In many ways, it was meals like these eased tension, softened tempers, brought strangers together, and sometimes even settled disputes more effectively than the sheriff could. A miner slumped at a table near the corner, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. He ordered a plate of fried potatoes, simple but beloved. The cook sliced them fast, tossed them in a sizzling pan with salt and a sprinkle of pepper, and fried them until edges curled and crisped. The miner's eyes brightened when the plate arrived. Those potatoes weren't just food, they were warmth. They were home. They reminded him of simpler times before he spent his days underground searching for silver veins that sometimes never appeared. A group of cowboys, still smelling faintly of cattle and sweat, ordered steaks, each cooked in a cast iron pan rubbed with lard. The meat sizzled loudly, adding music to the already chaotic symphony of the saloon. The cook seasoned each steak with salt, pepper, and a few wild herbs he dried earlier that summer. When he plated the steaks, the cowboys grinned like children on holiday, knives flashing as they carved into the hearty slabs of beef. They joked, argued, swapped stories of cattle drives, and took huge bites between sentences. At another table, a gambler dressed in a velvet vest and white gloves ordered something more refined: oyster stew. The saloon had received a shipment just yesterday, canned oysters packed in brine, shipped from far-off coasts. To some newcomers, it was almost surreal to eat oysters in a dusty desert town. But to seasoned Westerners, it was simply part of the strange magic of saloon life. The cook heated cream, butter, and oysters in a pot, adding black pepper and a hint of nutmeg. When served, the stew looked delicate, elegant, almost out of place. Yet as the gambler dipped his spoon into the velvety broth, he sighed in genuine appreciation. Fresh oysters were nearly a myth on the frontier. Canned oysters, though humble, became a badge of wealth. Only those with enough money or enough luck ordered them. Near the bar sat a quiet woman with her baby swaddled in a woolen blanket. Her husband, a scruffy ranch hand, worked late shifts outside town. She came to the saloon for food she couldn't cook at home since their cabin stove had recently broken. The cook knew her well. Without asking, he prepared her favorite, chicken and dumplings. The broth was thick, creamy, and fragrant, dotted with soft dumplings made from flour and lard. When she tasted the first spoonful, her shoulders softened. She fed small pieces of dumplings to her baby, whose wide eyes tracked every movement. For her, the saloon was not a place of noise or gambling. It was simply the town's kitchen, a place where warmth could be found on cold nights. As the evening deepened, new diners arrived, each with their own stories, their own hungers. A weathered traveler limped toward the bar, covered in dust so thick it looked like a second skin. He ordered jerky and beans, a combination so firmly woven into frontier tradition that it almost felt symbolic. The jerky was tough, salty, and smoked until nearly indestructible. The beans soft, hearty, full of flavor from hours spent simmering with onions and salt pork. When the traveler chewed the jerky, he felt the stiffness of days on the trail slowly leave his jaw. When he spooned the beans, he felt warmth spreading through his chilled limbs. Food had a way of grounding him, reminding him he was still alive after crossing treacherous terrain. At the far corner of the kitchen, a tray of apple pies cooled beside the window. Apple pies were a luxury. Apples didn't grow in most frontier towns. These particular apples had come from a distant valley where settlers had planted orchards years ago. The cook had sliced the apples thin, mixed them with sugar, cinnamon, and a bit of flour, and wrapped them in dough made that morning. The pies baked as the sun set, filling the saloon with a scent so homey that a few men wiped tears from their eyes when it drifted by. Apple pie tasted like hope. For many, it tasted like a home they would likely never see again. A prospector, eager to celebrate a lucky strike, purchased an entire pie for himself. He sat at a table surrounded by empty stools and ate slice after slice, the cinnamon mixing with memories too distant to name. Around him, the saloon swirled with life, but he remained in a quiet bubble, savoring sweetness. In the kitchen, the cook paused to catch his breath, wiping sweat from his brow. His stove hissed, popped, and breathed heat into the room. His sleeves were rolled above his elbows, flour dusted his shirt, and his apron bore battle marks from the evening's chaos. And yet his face held a quiet pride, not arrogance, but the satisfaction of feeding people who had survived another day in a landscape that often opposed their existence. Food in the Wild West was never just food, it was reassurance. It was a reminder of humanity amid wildness. It was the thing that made strangers share tables, laughter, and stories. But as the night wore on and the lantern light burned low, the saloon began to shift into another phase, the late-night one. Quieter, stranger, filled with tired souls searching for something beyond hunger. A lonely cowboy approached the bar and ordered sourdough and gravy. He ate slowly, staring at the knots in the wooden table, thinking about the long road ahead. The food grounded him. Without it, he might have drifted away into the shadows of the frontier. A pair of outlaws entered, dust rising from their coats. They didn't cause trouble tonight. They just wanted something warm in their stomachs, cornbread and beans served in deep bowls. They sat silently, eating with the intensity of men who didn't know if tomorrow would come. Even the bartender slipped into the back for a moment to snag a piece of salt pork, chewing thoughtfully before returning to work. Drinks flowed, cards slapped, dice rolled, laughter erupted and faded, arguments sparked and died, but the food never stopped. It stayed steady, a constant hum beneath the chaos. Toward midnight, the piano player, tired from hours of work, asked for a plate of griddle cakes. The cook obliged, frying the batter until it bubbled, then flipping it with a practiced flick of the wrist. The musician ate standing up, fork in one hand, hat tilted back on his head. The sweetness of the cakes rejuvenated him, and when he sat back at the piano, the saloon felt lighter, warmer, almost enchanted. Even as patrons drifted out into the night, the kitchen's work wasn't done. The cook washed pots with scalding water, swept flour from the worn wooden counters, and prepared dough for tomorrow's bread. In the back room, leftover stew sat cooling, destined to become the next day's lunch. Beans continued to simmer, their flavors deepening by the hour. Finally, when only embers remained in the stove and the saloon was nearly empty, the cook stepped outside into the cool night air. Stars littered the sky like scattered gold dust. Coyotes howled in the distance. The wind carried the faint scent of sagebrush. The cook stretched his arms and looked at the horizon, knowing that as long as there were hungry travelers, wild drifters, hopeful miners, bold gamblers, and tired cowboys, he would always have work. He would always have a role in this strange, untamed world. Because the food he cooked didn't simply fill stomachs, it held the frontier together, one meal at a time. As the night deepened outside the saloon and the glow from the lanterns settled into a soft amber haze, the atmosphere inside transformed into something quieter, warmer, and almost cozy. The earlier clatter of poker chips had softened, the piano player had slipped into slower, dreamlike melodies, and the conversations around the tables had become low murmurs, like distant streams trapped in glass. It was in these slower hours that the food of the Wild West took on a different glow. Earlier, when the rush was loud and chaotic, plates were slapped onto tables with brisk efficiency. But now, with fewer customers and the cool night air drifting in each time the swinging doors creaked, the cooks had more time to prepare dishes with a kind of deliberate patience. And folks who remained late were often the ones who savored these meals the most. One such dish was the late-night saddle stew, a variation of the stew served during dinner, but simmered so long that the chunks of beef practically melted under the slightest pressure of a spoon. It was said that if you ever found yourself in a saloon after midnight, tired from the road or worn thin from trail dust, a bowl of saddle stew could convince you that the world wasn't quite as hard as it seemed. Cowboys often joked that it tasted like the warmth of an old blanket. Cattle drivers said it was the closest thing to a mother's kitchen you could find west of the Mississippi. But the stew wasn't the only treasure of the late hours. Many saloons offered night cakes, a simple but beloved dish made from leftover biscuit, dough fried in lard until golden. These crisp-edged cakes were served with cane syrup, molasses, or sometimes even nothing at all for travelers too tired to care. They were warm, fragrant, and easy to eat while half asleep at a table. More than once, a cowboy had been found slumped over a plate of night cakes, snoring softly while one last piece cooled under his hand. The trail beans, now thickened from hours over the embers, took on a smoky richness that daytime diners rarely experienced. The beans absorbed flavor like sponges, salt pork, onion, lingering heat from red pepper flakes, and the faint ghost of mesquite from the fire that never quite went out. Some saloons added a splash of whiskey to the pot at night, claiming it woke the beans up. Whether or not this was true, the result was a dish that carried a warmth that crawled slow and steady through your bones, settling deep and staying there. As the hours grew quieter still and the last of the card games dwindled, the saloon keepers often prepared simple comfort plates that weren't listed on any board hanging behind the bar. These were the meals only regulars knew to ask for: small, familiar foods that spoke to the quieter side of frontier living. There was the working man's tater plate, a generous helping of pan-fried potatoes seasoned with black pepper and salt, sometimes with onions folded in if the kitchen had any left. Potatoes were cheap, filling, and forgiving, making them one of the most common foods in every saloon across the territories. No matter where you traveled, there was always a version of fried potatoes waiting for you. Then there were the salted soda crackers, served with bits of cheese, hard-boiled eggs, or slices of cold ham. These weren't meant to impress anyone, they were just simple, sturdy foods that settled easy in the stomach after a long day. Travelers loved them for that very reason. By this hour, the gamblers were fewer, the drinkers more mellow, and the conversations softer. A few patrons might still linger, prospectors rubbing dust off their boots, railroad workers letting their joints rest after a day of heavy labor, or cowhands who had no home except whichever saloon offered them a warm corner. They ate slowly, thoughtfully, savoring each bite as if it were the first real food they'd had all week. Outside, the wind carried the distant howls of coyotes wandering through the scrublands, and the faint thud of horse hooves moving along dirt paths as late riders made their way home. Inside, the faint smell of fried dough, seasoned meat, and strong coffee lingered in the air like a gentle blanket. By now, the saloon cook, who had been awake since before sunrise, often leaned against the counter, rubbing tired eyes but still willing to prepare one last plate if a weary traveler pushed the doors open. The Wild West could be unpredictable, and a saloon needed to be ready for anything. And there was always one dish always kept simmering no matter the hour: cowboy coffee, thick, dark, and strong enough to wake a corpse, as regulars said. It was brewed the old way, grounds thrown straight into the pot, boiled until it became a kind of liquid determination, then poured into tin cups where the last of the sediment settled at the bottom like tiny black stones. This coffee wasn't meant to be savored. It was meant to get you through another hour, another mile, another night on unforgiving land. As the night drifted closer to dawn, the cook would begin preparing the early riser plates, not quite breakfast, not quite midnight dinner. These were hearty combinations: leftover meat chopped into hash, eggs cracked onto hot iron, biscuits reheated and brushed with leftover bacon grease for extra flavor. These meals were prized by sheriffs starting early shifts, ranchers heading back to the fields, and weather-beaten travelers determined to reach the next town before the sun grew hot. The saloon, despite its reputation for gambling, whiskey, and rough characters, was also a place of nourishment, one that fed the tired, comforted the lonely, and gave the weary a place to sit and rest. And in the Wild West, where so many lived on the razor's edge between hope and hardship, a warm meal could feel like a small miracle. As dawn crept closer, faint light began to seep through the cracks in the wooden walls of the saloon, turning dust particles into tiny, drifting stars. The lantern flames flickered softly in the quiet room, fighting the pale morning glow like old sentries reluctant to surrender. He began preparing the first dish of the morning, trail hash, often called ranch pan, a staple that every saloon from Kansas to New Mexico offered in one form or another. The potatoes crisped in lard, the beef softened from the long simmer, and the onions caramelized in patches of golden brown that tasted like a smoky sunrise. Folks said that if you were lucky enough to catch a plate of trail hash at a saloon before the sun fully rose, you'd eat better than the governor of the territory. Beside the hash, the cook prepared griddle eggs, cracked directly onto the iron with practiced flicks of his wrist. The yolks glowed like tiny suns, a bright contrast to the darkened surface of the griddle. Eggs weren't always available, and when they were prized expensive, fragile things transported across miles of rough terrain. When a saloon had eggs to serve, word traveled fast, and the morning crowd grew thick with men eager for a break from beans and jerky. Alongside the eggs came the biscuits of the dawn, so named because they were the first thing many travelers tasted after waking up with sand in their teeth and stiffness in their bones. These biscuits were dense, warm, and dependable, split open with the edge of a knife and spread with butter when the saloon could get it, or drizzled with a thin line of molasses when butter was nothing but a memory. The biscuits were baked in iron pans that had been seasoned from years of use, and somehow they always carried a subtle flavor that couldn't quite be traced, part smoke, part earth, part morning air. As the cook worked, the smell of sizzling food began to drift into every corner of the saloon, coaxing the last few drowsy patrons into fuller wakefulness. One miner stretched at his table, yawning wide enough to make his jaw pop. Another man, wrapped in a long coat he used as a blanket, rubbed his eyes and lifted his head slowly like a bear blinking awake after a winter sleep. Then came the sound that always marked the shift from night to morning: the first pour of fresh cowboy coffee. The pot, blackened by years of campfires and iron stoves, groaned slightly as the cook lifted it. He poured the steaming, pitch-dark liquid into tin cups that clinked lightly on the wooden counter. The scent was bold, almost bitter, yet comforting in its own way. This coffee was the fuel that kept the West running, harsh but honest. Travelers sipped it slowly, letting the warmth spread through their chest like a small fire. Some grimaced at the strength, others chuckled at its roughness. But all of them drank it because there was no better companion for a cold morning in an untamed land. As the first real rays of sunlight slid across the saloon floor, illuminating the grain of the wooden boards, the cook prepared one more dish, not a staple, not an expectation, but a kind of special indulgence found mostly in larger, more prosperous towns: hot iron flapjacks. Flapjacks were a luxury in saloons. They required flour, sugar, and sometimes milk, ingredients not always guaranteed. But when available, they were served in stacks, lightly browned, tender at the center, and steaming when split open. A spoonful of syrup or molasses drizzled over them turned the entire morning brighter. For cowhands who'd been eating dried beef and beans for weeks on the trail, flapjacks tasted like a holiday. By mid-morning, the saloon was fully awake again. Fresh patrons arrived, ranch hands on their way to fields, blacksmiths starting their day, mail carriers preparing for long rides. The clatter of chairs, the murmur of orders, and the steady hum of talk filled the room. Morning meals were simpler than evening spreads, but they were essential, grounding, familiar. And yet, beneath the routine, one thing never changed: the sense that saloon food, no matter how humble, carried a kind of quiet purpose. It didn't try to astonish or impress. It didn't pretend to be grand. It simply fed whoever walked through those swinging doors, stranger or regular, rich man or drifter, tired traveler or hopeful newcomer, because out on the frontier, everyone needed a warm plate and a moment of rest. By late morning, when the sun had climbed high enough to warm the sign hanging above the swinging doors, the saloon entered one of its quieter stretches. The early workers had been fed, the night owls had wandered off to rest, and the piano sat silent, waiting for evening. During these hours, the saloon-esque kitchen turned its attention to tasks few patrons ever saw: preparing the midday offerings. Midday meals at Wild West saloons varied widely depending on the town, the terrain, the weather, and whatever wagon shipments had made it through the week. Some days there was plenty of fresh food. Other days, a saloon served only what could be hunted, trapped, or preserved. But one dish, no matter the circumstances, appeared in nearly every saloon from Dakota Territory to New Mexico. Midday beef round. Thin slices of beef cut from tougher parts of the animal, pounded with the blunt side of a knife to soften it, then pan-fried with onions, and a splash of whatever seasoning the cook could find. Some used chili powder, others used garlic, and a few used nothing but salt. The smell of sizzling beef drifting into the dusty street was often enough to pull travelers straight through the swinging doors. Alongside the beef came settlement bread, an all-purpose loaf baked earlier that morning. Settlement bread was thick, dense, and slightly chewy. Made with basic flour and sometimes a bit of cornmeal, it was far from elegant, but it filled the belly better than anything else. Slices of it were served plain, or toasted with a smear of lard or butter. When the bread was fresh, it felt like a small gift. When it was stale, it was dunked into stews until it softened like damp clay. By midday, the cook also began simmering a second pot of stew, the town pot, as it was called. Unlike the slow, rich stew of the night before, the town pot was made with whatever was abundant that day. Sometimes it was beef. Other times jackrabbit, venison, or even prairie chicken. The broth varied from thin and peppery to thick and hearty. No 2 days ever tasted the same. Travelers found great comfort in the town pot. It didn't promise consistency. It promised warmth, sustenance, and a reminder that no one survived the frontier alone. A wooden bowl of stew, even the simplest kind, carried a feeling of being cared for, however briefly. As the sun continued its climb toward noon, another dish made its way onto tables: corn cakes, flattened rounds of cornmeal batter cooked on the hot iron until the edges crisped. Corn cakes were easy to prepare, inexpensive, and beloved by nearly everyone. Sometimes they came with honey, other times with beans. On lean days, they arrived alone, carried on a tin plate that clinked softly when set down. They were the kind of food that quieted hunger quickly, allowing travelers to keep moving without feeling bogged down. For cowboys who had to rope cattle hours later, corn cakes were fuel. For miners preparing to descend into the earth, they were the last bright thing they saw before stepping into the dark. By noon, the saloon filled again, but not with gamblers or rowdy drinkers. This crowd was made of townsfolk catching their breath between the demands of daily work. Blacksmiths with soot still clinging to their arms. School teachers grateful for an hour of quiet before the roar of students returned. Merchants taking a break from tallying numbers and sweeping shop floors. Ranch hands who had ridden in on horseback, brushing dust off their sleeves before sitting. They came not for spectacle, but for the sense of routine the saloon provided. No matter how unpredictable life was outside, the threats of storms, drought, broken wagons, or wandering bandits, the saloon offered something steady. A meal that didn't judge. A place where hunger could be silenced. Around this time, saloons also served cold plates, simple assortments of preserved foods, strips of dried beef, wedges of pale cheese, sliced pickles, and sometimes a boiled potato or two. Cold plates were especially popular with travelers short on time. They could be eaten quickly, packed into saddlebags, or shared between two people without much fuss. And for those with a sweeter tooth, some saloons offered the only dessert the West could always rely on: molasses pie. The pie wasn't always elegant. Sometimes it arrived unevenly baked, sometimes the crust was a little too thick, and sometimes the filling leaned more toward syrup than custard. But it was sweet, and in the sparse desert towns where sweetness was rare, molasses pie felt like a treasure. Children especially loved it. If you were lucky enough to witness a family passing through a frontier town, you might see a child sitting on a saloon step outside, eating a slice with both hands, molasses dripping down their fingers, their eyes wide with the delight only a rare treat can bring. As the midday rush faded and the sun eased into its long, golden afternoon climb, The saloon settled into a steady, comfortable quiet. The kind of quiet that wrapped itself gently around the room, not silence, but a soft lull where the clink of a fork or a cough from a distant booth sounded louder than usual. Dust motes drifted lazily through streams of sunlight, giving the whole saloon a hazy amber glow, as if the world beyond the windows had slowed down just enough to take a breath. This was the saloon's thoughtful hour, the time when the cook could finally wipe his brow, scratch his beard, and breathe in the scent of simmering pots without the rush of impatient voices. He often used this time to prepare the foods needed for the evening crowd, which would arrive with an energy entirely different from the gentle afternoon guests. On a back counter, he began slicing salt pork, the essential ingredient for countless frontier dishes. Salt pork was durable, long-lasting, and forgiving qualities highly valued in a land where supplies traveled hundreds of miles by wagon. Sometimes it was boiled to mellow its sharpness. Other times, diced and fried to provide the savory base for beans or greens. The cook also set aside a pot for evening beans, a special batch prepared for the night's festivities. Beans might seem simple, but in the West, they were practically sacred. Some cooks swore that the secret was letting them soak in cool water from dawn to dusk. Others insisted on adding a spoonful of molasses. A few tossed in a dry chili to lend a hidden kick. No matter the method, evening beans were a dish people relied on after long hours of dust, sun, and saddle strain. Further along the counter sat baskets of freshly chopped vegetables, onions, carrots, maybe a few celery stalks if the town was prosperous enough that week. Vegetables were tricky to keep on the frontier. They wilted fast and traveled badly. When a shipment arrived, saloons used every scrap, slicing thin pieces for soups, frying them into hash, or simmering them into broths that soothed the stomach and strengthened the weary. The cook also prepared for one of the most reliable saloon dishes of the late afternoon: buffalo roast sandwiches. In regions where buffalo still roamed the plains, saloons took advantage of the hearty, flavorful meat. Slow-cooked until tender, buffalo roast was sliced thin and layered between pieces of settlement bread. A ladle of thick gravy often soaked the top, creating a sandwich so rich that even the toughest cowhand paused after the first bite, letting the flavor settle before continuing. These sandwiches were a quiet luxury, reminding travelers that the West wasn't always harsh and spare. Sometimes it offered meals that rivaled the best kitchens back east. The cook also turned his attention to a dish known across saloons as the miner's plate. This particular meal was popular among men who spent long hours underground chipping away at rock walls. Their bodies needed fuel that stuck with them, meals high in fat, protein, and warmth. The miner's plate was a hearty combination: thick slices of fried pork or beef, pan-fried potatoes with pepper, and a dollop of beans on the side. Sometimes a biscuit completed the plate. Other times, a chunk of bread substituted. When the dish arrived steaming at a table, miners would eat with slow determination, as if each bite rebuilt the strength the earth had stolen from them that morning. As the shadows lengthened across the floorboards, the saloon began preparing for one more important offering: preserved fish. It might sound strange for such an arid environment, but saloons often serve salted or smoked fish, sometimes trout, if there was a river nearby, other times preserved cod brought in from faraway coasts. The fish was soaked to remove the salt, then fried until crisp along the edges. Paired with potatoes or bread, it offered a surprising variety for patrons tired of beef-heavy meals. But perhaps the most comforting dish of the afternoon was chicken and dumplings, when available. Chickens were valuable creatures in frontier towns, so they weren't slaughtered often. But when one was used for cooking, the entire saloon felt the excitement. The smell of slow-simmered chicken broth drifting into the main room lifted spirits instantly. Dumplings' soft, doughy clouds floated atop the pot, absorbing the savory flavor. Guests who managed to get a bowl often ate slowly, savoring the warmth that trickled through them with every spoonful. Outside, the dusty street remained still, save for a few horses tied up at the post and the occasional wagon rumbling by. The air carried the dry scent of sagebrush and sun-baked earth. Inside, the cook's gentle preparations filled the saloon with the fragrances of onions, broth, fried meat, and fresh bread, a mixture that wrapped itself around anyone who stepped through the doors, no matter how weary or worn from the road. By late afternoon, the saloon was ready for whatever the evening drew in: cowboys, gamblers, travelers, drifters, prospectors, and everyone in between. The tables were reset, the lanterns trimmed, and the kitchen braced for the lively storm that came every night. Because in the Wild West, food wasn't just sustenance, it was an anchor. A reminder that even in the most unpredictable of places, there were still warm meals, familiar flavors, and moments of rest waiting behind those swinging doors. As the afternoon sun drifted lower, painting the horizon in strokes of gold and copper, the saloon prepared for its busiest transformation. This time of day, the moment between daylight and dusk, held a particular energy. Shadows stretched across the wooden floors, lanterns were lit one by one, and the gentle hum of voices from outside signaled that townsfolk and travelers alike were beginning to gather. Evening was coming fast, and with it, the hearty foods that defined saloon life after dark. The cook, now fully awake from his brief midday rest, stood before a heavy iron pot, stirring its contents with a long wooden spoon. This pot held one of the most beloved evening dishes in many saloons. Chili stack, a thick, bold, deeply seasoned chili that clung to every spoonful like a hearty promise. This chili wasn't fancy, it wasn't sweet, it wasn't meant to be polite. It was rugged, fiery, full of beef, beans, tomatoes if available, and enough spices to clear the dust from a traveler's lungs. Some saloons even served the chili with a side of corn dodgers, small, firm cornmeal cakes that cowhands often dipped straight into the pot. Others offered sliced onions atop the chili, or a sprinkle of crumbled crackers when times were good. But no matter how it was served, chili stack brought people together. The saloon filled with the unmistakable scent, smoky, peppery, rich like a warm blanket thrown across the room. In another pot simmered a dish known as cowboy slop, a generous mix of potatoes, ground beef, onions, and gravy, all stirred into a cohesive, comforting blend. It didn't look glamorous, but it filled stomachs better than almost anything. Cowboys, after long hours riding fences or herding cattle across endless plains, devoured it quickly, spoon after spoon, barely pausing to breathe. Cowboy slop tasted like home for men who hadn't seen home in months. Nearby, the cook arranged slabs of meat on a crackling grill steak cuts. Simple, rugged, usually sliced from tougher parts of the cow, but grilled long enough to soften. The steak sizzled loudly, sending up plumes of savory smoke that drifted across the saloon, clinging to the wooden beams like a familiar friend. Patrons would often slap their coins down on the counter, asking for the biggest cut, then eat it with nothing but a knife and a chunk of bread. Some saloons also offered roasted sausage links, seasoned with pepper and garlic when such luxuries could be found. The sausages snapped when bitten into, releasing their juices and a burst of flavor that never failed to delight the evening crowd. Many enjoyed them with mustard. Others preferred them plain. But all agreed that sausages were the perfect food for a night of gambling and storytelling. The cook also prepared a favorite dish among travelers who had grown tired of heavy meats: vegetable pot, a stew made entirely from whatever fresh vegetables the saloon could secure from local farmers. The aroma alone was enough to halt arguments, soothe tempers, and lift spirits. Even those who were short on money could still enjoy smaller dishes. Many saloons offered tin cup soup, a ladle of broth poured into a metal cup, sometimes thick with vegetables, sometimes thin and peppery, but always warm. Alongside it came ration crackers, hard, dry biscuits that softened when dipped into the soup. For drifters with only a few coins left to their name, This meal could be the difference between going hungry or feeling human again. As the sun disappeared fully behind the horizon, the saloon transformed into a lively, bustling haven. The piano player returned to his instrument, filling the air with melodies that danced between tables. Laughter rose and fell like waves. Plates were carried back and forth, each filled with the foods that made evenings in the Wild West feel alive, bold, hearty, smoky, satisfying. The cook, though weary, continued his rhythm-stirring pots, flipping meat, slicing bread, carrying meals from stove to counter with quiet precision. He knew the crowd would stay late, and that the saloon's food played a part in keeping the peace. A man with a full stomach caused far less trouble than one running on hunger and whiskey alone. And so the evening wore on, filled with stories, clattering plates, lantern light, and the smells of foods that defined a rugged, restless land. And so the sun dipped low behind the jagged line of the western horizon, painting the plains in bruised purples and ember-orange streaks. Inside the dusty willow, lanterns flickered awake one by one, their soft glow settling like a warm blanket over the crowd. For travelers who had ridden 12 dusty miles just to see a lamplight and a roof, that glow was as comforting as a mother's hand. And with nightfall came the real business of the saloon, the food that kept the frontier running. Harlan wiped his hands on a flour-dusted apron and peeked out through the open doorway to the dining room, where miners, ranchers, gamblers, and wanderers were beginning to settle in. Every night brought a different mix of faces, some familiar, some passing through, all of them hungry in a way that only the West could shape. The kind of hunger that came from living too close to hardship and too far from anything certain. Tonight's menu was the same as most nights because the West didn't offer much room for fanciful culinary experiments. But what it did offer was hearty, honest food served hot and heavy on dented tin plates. And that alone was enough to pull a tired soul back from the edge. Harlan lumbered toward the long wooden table where he kept his ingredients. He began with the meal that everyone expected: chili and beans, thick as clay and twice as filling. He stirred a pot so large it could drown a calf, its contents bubbling with dried chilies a traveler had traded him 2 weeks back. Ground beef was a luxury he rarely had. So tonight's chili was made with chunks of leftover stew meat and a handful of coffee grounds to deepen the flavor. It was an old cowboy trick, and it made the chili rich enough that even the whiskey-soaked regulars would grunt their approval. "Smells finer than gold dust in spring," called one of the miners from the doorway. "That's 'cause you ain't smelled gold dust," Harlan muttered, but secretly he liked the compliment. While the chili simmered, he turned to sourdough biscuits, slapped together from starter older than the saloon itself. Ranch hands claimed those biscuits could wake a man from death or knock him back into it, depending on how long Harlan left them in the fire. Tonight they came out golden and steaming, perfect for dragging along the bottom of a chili bowl or soaking up grease from a plate of salted pork. Next came the buffalo steak, though calling it that was generous. These were thin strips carved from a tover cut and slapped onto a pan that hissed with fat. Still, no one complained. Buffalo meat tasted like survival, deep, earthy, and wild. Every bite reminded the men around the tables that they lived in a land still untamed, where beasts larger than wagons once thundered across the plains. By now the dining room was filling fast. The card tables were loud with arguments over anti-sizes. The piano player was tuning up, which meant he was hitting keys at random until something felt right. Over the din came the smell of Harlan's next dish, venison stew. A staple whenever a hunter in town was willing to trade meat for a hot meal and a bed of hay in the stables. The stew cooked with onions, wild herbs, and vegetables grown in a scraggly patch behind the saloon that barely managed to survive the desert winds. The barkeep, Lila May, leaned into the kitchen doorway. Her sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong arms shaped by years of lifting barrels and breaking up brawls. "You got any of that trail coffee made yet?" she asked. "Crowd's getting twitchy." "In a minute," Harlan said, pulling a blackened pot from the fire. The coffee inside was so thick it barely sloshed. The secret, as the old-timers demanded, was crushing eggshells into the brew. It settled the grounds and cut the bitterness, though it still tasted like something that could strip paint from a locomotive. Lila May poured some into tin cups and balanced a tray with one hand. "If this don't keep them awake, the gunshots will." She disappeared into the noise outside, the door swinging shut behind her. Harlan moved on to a dish special to nights when travelers came from the southern trails. Spiced beans with salt pork, cooked slow until the flavors merged like old friends. The pork crackled in the heat, sending up curls of smoke fragrant with salt and fat. Beans had become the heartbeat of most saloon meals. Cheap, sturdy, easy to transport, they were as constant as the wind sweeping the plains. He set aside plates of cornbread, coarse but sweet, made with molasses when he had it and without when he didn't. Tonight was a molasses night, always a good sign. Outside, a hush fell over the room. Harlan peered through the doorway and saw that a group of new travelers had entered. Their coats were long dust-stained and heavy from a day's ride. One carried a guitar, another a rifle, and all of them carried the kind of exhaustion that could only be cured by food or sleep. "Evenin'," Lila May told them. "Kitchen still servin'. Seats wherever you find 'em." They did. And as they sat, Harlan recognized the look in their eyes, men who'd been living on hardtack, jerky, and the occasional unlucky rabbit. Wild West travel wasn't romantic. It was teeth-breaking, stomach-churning, grit-filled business. For these men, saloon food wasn't just dinner, it was salvation. Harlan returned to his stove, preparing something special. Cowboy fried potatoes, sliced rough and thrown into a pan with onions, salt, and enough bacon grease to drown regrets. Nothing filled a belly quicker. Then came the pickled goods, usually eaten by those desperate for something that resembled vegetables. Pickled eggs, pickled cucumbers, even pickled carrots when he had them. Stored in giant jars cloudy with vinegar, the pickles added crunch to the monotonous world of saloon fare. A young boy, barely old enough to haul water, poked his head into the kitchen. "Table by the window wants something sweet," he said. "They asked if you got pie," Harlan snorted. "Pie? This ain't Boston," but he did have dried apple pie, made with apples rehydrated in hot water and spiced with whatever he could find. It wasn't flaky and it wasn't pretty, but it was sweet enough to make grown men hum under their breath. He handed the boy a plate. "Tell him not to judge it by looking." As the night deepened, the saloon turned louder. The piano man found a rhythm, gamblers found trouble, and cowboys found reasons to argue about horses. But above all the chaos, plates kept clattering, spoons kept scraping, and bellies kept being filled. That was the quiet miracle of Wild West saloons. They didn't look like much. They didn't serve fine cuisine. But they fed the people who carved lives into a land that didn't always want them. Every meal was a promise, that for a few minutes, at least, you could be warm, full, and human. Near midnight, when the crowd thinned and the lamps guttered low, Harlan finally dropped into a chair. His feet hurt. His back hurt. Even his eyelids hurt. But the pots were empty, and that meant the West had survived another day. Harlan rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand, staring at the last wisps of steam curling from the emptied chili pot. The kitchen felt eerily quiet, the way a battlefield must seem after the smoke cleared and the shouting stopped. Outside, the saloon had dimmed to a low murmur, just a few diehards lingering over whiskey and cards, unwilling to surrender the day to sleep. But Harlan still had work to do. He pushed himself up with a grunt and began clearing the chaos he had created. Spoons that had survived too many nights, chipped plates with stories older than the men who ate from them, pans so blackened they reflected nothing at all. Each piece was part of the saloon, part of the rhythm that kept the frontier fed and alive. As he scrubbed a stubborn pot, the door creaked open behind him. "Evenin', Harlan," came a soft voice. He didn't need to turn. Only one person in the whole territory spoke with that particular tired warmth. Clara Mayfield, owner of the Dusty Willow, widow of its founder, and the unspoken leader of everyone who wandered through its swinging doors. A woman whose mere presence could cool tempers or raise spirits, depending on the moment. She stepped into the flickering lamplight, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Heard you kept the new travelers fed tonight." "Fed, filled, and full," Harlan said. "A man could die happy after buffalo steak and beans," Clara chuckled. "Let's hope none of them do." "I don't need the sheriff asking why your biscuits hit harder than whiskey," Harlan shrugged. "If they can't handle frontier food, they shouldn't be ridden the frontier." She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You ever think about how many miles walk into this saloon every night? How many stories sit down at these tables?" "Plenty with more dust than sense," Harlan said. But he knew what she meant. Every plate he served had ridden over plains, through canyons, past dangers that hid in the grass or waited on the trail. People came hungry, tired, uncertain, and the saloon, this messy, noisy, grease-scented refuge, had become a lifeline. "Funny thing," Clara said softly. Out there on the trail, nobody asks for much. They'll sleep on dirt, drink from streams, live off jerky. But inside a saloon, the whole world changes. Folks remember what comfort feels like, Harlan nodded. Food's the closest thing to home most of these men ever get. She gave him a small smile, sad and proud, all at once. That's why the dusty willow stands. For a moment, silence wrapped the kitchen. Outside, the last card game finally folded. Boots thudded across the wooden floorboards as men stumbled toward their rented bunks or the street. Clara placed a hand on Harlan's shoulder. Before you clean everything, you might want to put another pot on. He blinked. Another? At this hour? She nodded toward the back door. Trail crew just rode in. 8 men. Look near dead, Harlan sighed, rolling his sleeves back up. Well, they ain't dying on my floor. He moved with renewed purpose. Back went the iron pot on the fire. In went beans, water, salt, and a handful of dried herbs. Next came strips of jerked beef, torn by hand and tossed into the pot to soften and flavor the broth. It wasn't fancy, nothing about the West was, but it was hearty, hot, and life-saving. As the stew simmered, Harlan fried what little bacon he had left and set out the last loaf of cornbread. It was crumbly and uneven, but it was warm, and that was enough. When the 8 trail riders entered a few minutes later, faces hollow, clothes dripping with cold night sweat, they didn't ask for whiskey first. They asked for food. And Harlan, without ceremony or speech, served them bowls so full they could barely carry them. One man, barely more than a boy, stared at his stew as though it were a miracle. Sir, he whispered, voice cracking. This is the first hot meal I've had in 5 days. Harlan didn't know how to respond to gratitude like that. Most frontier folks didn't, so he only nodded gruffly and moved on to serve the next rider. But the boy's words echoed in his mind. In a land where everything was unpredictable, weather, fortunes, life itself, a warm meal could feel like mercy. The riders ate in silence at first, the kind of silence that comes from exhaustion too deep for conversation. But as the food settled in their bellies, they began to breathe easier. Shoulders relaxed, faces softened. One even laughed, a ragged, relieved sound. Clara stepped beside Harlan, watching the men eat. You give them more than food, she said. Harlan shook his head. Just stew. No, she whispered. You give them a piece of the world that doesn't take from them. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Outside, the wind howled low across the plains. Coyotes called in the distance. The night was cold and vast and indifferent. But inside the dusty willow, the lamplight was warm, the fire crackled steady, and 8 weary riders ate like kings. That was the quiet magic of saloons, not the whiskey, not the cards or music, but the food that reminded people they were still alive. And tomorrow, more strangers would wander through those doors, hungry and worn, looking for that same fleeting refuge. And Harlan would be there, stirring pots and baking biscuits, feeding the West one plate at a time. The night stretched deeper, and the dusty willow settled into a rhythm all its own. Lanterns swayed with each creak of the floorboards, sending shadows flickering across the walls, painting the familiar faces of patrons in amber light. The smell of stew, fried meat, and cornbread hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint tang of whiskey and dust carried in on tired boots. Every corner of the saloon felt alive with warmth and purpose, the kind of energy that made the West feel just a little less wild. Harlan wiped his hands on his apron and checked the simmering stew. The jerky had softened, releasing a smoky, savory aroma that curled into the rafters. He ladled a generous portion into a tin bowl and carried it across the room to a pair of cowhands sitting side by side. Their eyes were weary, their clothes streaked with mud and sweat, but their gratitude came in the form of quiet nods and murmured thanks. No fanfare, no flourishes, just recognition that a hot meal in the West could be a lifeline. Across the room, another dish was being prepared, one Harlan reserved for nights when travelers came through from towns far enough away to bring exotic touches. Chicken fricassee, made with whatever fowl had survived the week. The chicken was browned carefully, then stewed with onions and a touch of herbs, producing a thick, savory sauce that clung to bread and potatoes alike. Even the roughest cowhands, who lived their lives on jerky and beans, would eat this slowly, savoring each bite as though it were a rare treasure. Meanwhile, trays of fried potatoes and onions made their rounds, passed from hand to hand, fork to fork. There was a particular joy in these simple dishes, the way a golden, crispy edge or a hint of onion could lift a man's spirit after days in the saddle. They were humble, affordable, and consistent, and in the West, consistency was a comfort more precious than gold. For those who could spare the coin, the cook offered the evening's special smoked trout, brought in by a traveling fisherman who had reached the small town just that morning. The trout was smoked over mesquite and carefully flaked over a plate of buttered bread. Patrons ate it quietly, listening to the piano in the corner, letting the delicate flavor remind them of rivers far from the plains they called home. Even desserts were practical but welcomed. Molasses cookies, soft in the center and crisp around the edges, were handed out on small tin plates. Children who had come along with their parents ate them slowly, licking sticky fingers clean and smiling at the warmth of the saloon around them. Adults often took a cookie with their coffee, allowing a brief, sweet reprieve in a long, hard day. As the night deepened further, the saloon became a place of storytelling. With plates full of beef stew and cornbread, men and women swapped tales of the trail narrow escapes, harsh winters, cattle drives that went sideways, and gold panning that ended in disappointment. Food was at the center of these stories, either as the reward for a hard day or the thing that nearly caused a fight. A bite of fried steak or a cup of thick coffee could transform a man from weary to lively, ready to argue or joke, to boast or to mourn. The cook rarely participated in these stories. He knew better. His job was to observe, to provide sustenance, to anticipate needs before anyone spoke them aloud. Another bowl of beans for the tired rider. Another biscuit for the miner who had worked long hours. A ladle of stew for the young boy who'd traveled too far to see family. The West had no room for generosity without purpose. Harlan's meals carried purpose in every bite. By midnight, when the piano slowed and only a few patrons remained, Harlan began the final preparations. Trail soup, a mixture of leftover vegetables, meat scraps, and beans, was set to simmer gently. It would serve the last stragglers and provide nourishment for early risers. Plates were cleaned and stacked, knives sharpened, and the floors swept of crumbs and sawdust. The saloon, though noisy and chaotic for much of the day, ended the night in quiet, deliberate care. Outside, the wind whispered across the plains. Horses huffed in the stables. The sky stretched endlessly, filled with stars that seemed closer here than anywhere else. And inside the dusty willow, food remained the thread that held it all together. Each plate was more than nourishment. It was a bridge between lives, a moment of peace in a world that rarely offered it, a reminder that survival was always sweeter with warmth in your belly and friends nearby. Harlan leaned against the counter, exhausted but satisfied. His hands bore the traces of a day spent feeding a frontier town, but his heart carried the quiet pride of keeping life moving in one of the harshest places on earth. Each pot stirred, each loaf baked, each bowl served. This was the work of sustaining not just bodies, but spirits. And when the last traveler left, tipping his hat to Harlan and muttering thanks, the cook allowed himself a small smile. Tomorrow would be another day, another set of plates. Another mix of stories, laughter, and quiet thanks. Because in the Wild West, saloon food wasn't just about eating, it was about surviving, connecting, and finding a little comfort in a world that rarely offered any. As midnight gave way to the deep hours before dawn, the dusty willow began its quiet transformation. Most of the patrons had left, either to bunks, wagons, or the open prairie, but a few stubborn souls lingered. Gamblers hunched over tables, counting cards with bleary eyes. A lone musician softly picked at his guitar in the corner, filling the air with haunting melodies that mingled with the soft clinking of empty glasses. And through it all, the cook Harlan moved like a shadow, tending the last pots, keeping the fires alive, preparing for the early risers who would come with the first light. One of the first dishes of the late-night hours was always oatmeal mash, simple, thick, and hot. Made with coarse oats boiled in water or whatever milk was left, it was far from fancy, but it warmed the body and quieted the rumbling stomach. Sometimes Harlan added a spoonful of molasses or a sprinkling of dried fruit, which travelers considered a minor luxury. He stirred slowly, allowing the oatmeal to thicken, watching the steam curl in the lantern light like a living thing. Alongside oatmeal, he prepared salted bacon strips, crispy, savory, the kind of meat that could wake a man from exhaustion and make him feel alert in minutes. Bacon was more than flavor. It was energy, warmth, and comfort all in one. He stacked it on plates alongside leftover biscuits, some toasted slightly over the embers, others soft and yielding. The combination was simple, yet for those traveling the endless plains it felt like a feast. In another corner, a pot of late-night bean stew simmered slowly, rich with chunks of jerky, a few scraps of pork, and thickened with mashed potatoes when necessary. Beans were never wasted. Even the tiniest portion found its way into the pot. Every stir reminded Harlan that survival in the West was often a matter of using what you had and making it enough. Each spoonful, served to someone half frozen, half starved, brought satisfaction that went beyond the simple act of eating. By now, the lanterns cast long shadows across the room, revealing the worn marks in the floorboards where countless boots had scuffed and countless stools had scraped. The saloon felt alive with echoes, the clatter of knives against plates, the soft murmur of conversation that had faded but lingered, the faint squeak of hinges on the swinging doors that let in gusts of cold night air. Food was the constant here, unchanging, a reliable rhythm that matched the pulse of the land itself. Harlan prepared trail porridge, thicker than oatmeal, made with cornmeal or wheat when available. This dish was for the earliest risers, cowhands, drovers, or mail riders who would be gone by first light. They came to the saloon before the world was fully awake, often in near silence, slipping in from the shadows, hands red from cold. Porridge, steaming and simple, gave them the energy to mount saddles, hitch horses, and face the day. Even a plain bowl felt like a gift in the quiet dark. For those who had a little extra coin, Harlan occasionally served fried chicken livers, coated in cornmeal and fried until golden. These were delicacies in the West, small luxuries that made nights memorable. The aroma alone could draw even the hardest-hearted cowboys from their chairs. Diners ate them slowly, savoring each bite, mindful of the fact that in the wilderness, such pleasures were fleeting. By the first faint streaks of dawn, the saloon had begun filling again. Riders arrived with frost on their coats, horses shivering outside. Their eyes were half-lidded from the cold, half alert for the warmth of food and shelter. Harlan greeted them with nods and ladled hearty breakfast hash, made from leftover meat, potatoes, onions, and whatever scraps could be found. It was messy, filling, and exactly what the West demanded at this hour. Alongside the hash, he set out freshly baked biscuits, spread with a touch of butter or molasses, if supplies allowed. The smell of biscuits baking carried down the street, coaxing early risers from their bunks, and alerting travelers that a warm meal awaited. Even those who had been sleeping under open skies for days felt a surge of relief when the doors swung open and the first heat of the stove brushed their faces. Coffee was poured into tin cups, thick and strong, black enough to sting the tongue but smooth enough to wake the spirit. The smell of it mixed with frying bacon, hash, and biscuits, creating a sensory memory that stayed with travelers long after they had left the dusty willow. By sunrise, the saloon was alive once more. Tables were crowded, knives and forks clattered on plates, and the faint hum of conversation rose above the morning breeze outside. Harlan moved quietly between pots, pans, and plates, feeding the West one hearty, humble meal at a time. Every dish from beans to biscuits, from hash to fried livers, told the story of survival, of resilience, and of the human need for warmth, comfort, and sustenance. And as the first rays of sun touched the plains, Harlan paused, looking over the room. Each plate served, each pot stirred, each tin cup filled, carried the same quiet truth. In the Wild West, a saloon was more than a building. It was a sanctuary, and the food within it was its soul.